All right, JK. So thanks so much for coming back and doing a second episode since first one was such a smashing runaway success. I thought we would dig in specifically on Kinam or Kiara for this episode and introduce kind of what it actually is. Talk a little bit about if it's actually worth it, whatever that even means, or if it's just kind of cultural hype or just like a status symbol, and just really jump into this insane, crazy, mysterious world. Like if agarwood itself wasn't complicated and crazy enough, we're gonna take it to the next level, and it's gonna just get way more complicated, way more crazy, way more nuanced, way more expensive, and to me, just really deeply and profoundly fascinating. So I think we'll hopefully uncover a lot of interesting things.
What's crazy to me is we talked 2 weeks ago, and I don't even think we
Right.
coordinated this, but we both got haircuts.
That is true. That's, I mean,
That's how
yeah, I
wildly
was,
successful this has been. We both decided to clean up a little bit.
yeah, I think, yeah, I was definitely overdue. Beard trim and a haircut for me, so we definitely want to take it to the next level for the second one. So I guess just to jump in, like for people who don't even know what Kenam is or Kiara or what those words even mean, maybe you could just start off by just defining them, introducing those concepts.
Sure. So there's a couple ways of approaching this. And the first thing I'll say for people that aren't familiar with agarwood, I'll ask people what they think the most expensive woods on the planet are. And usually the answers, if especially if people kind of know what they're talking about, will be ebony and rosewood.
Mm,
And in the commercial kind of carving, the world like furniture and guitars and things like this, carvings, they would be correct if they said rosewood and ebony. Ebony first and then rosewood. But actually there's a whole tier of woods that are of higher value than of higher commercial value than those, and that would be agarwood and sandalwood, of which
yep.
people in the West have generally heard of sandalwood. Most people have not heard of agarwood. And so when you
Right.
try to start explaining to them what agarwood is, the rarity and the expense, it's like it kind of goes over their heads and doesn't even
For sure.
register because it's just astronomical and doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So part of what makes agarwood so expensive is the rarity in the wild. Now, of course, they're plantation farming and inducing trees today, which on the one hand helps bring down the cost, but the quality isn't quite the same as the wild stuff. I would say a good comparison would be like trying to compare farmed ginseng or wild mimicking ginseng to like truly wild old ginseng. You can't
Yep.
you can't replicate age and stress.
Yep.
So agarwood, I have a few show and tells here. We'll get more into these a bit later, but agarwood really is an infection that happens inside a tree, and then they have to carve away the tree. So if you can imagine, and this would be the cross section, if you can imagine, this is inside the tree somewhere. Now, a lot of people value heartwood better. Of course, it forms in branches and roots. It's like different regions within the tree, and it makes different types of formations. But imagine you have a tree here, and then they have to carve all this away, and it can get
Yeah.
really, really intricate, especially around formations like this is an insect formation. And imagine having to carve out all that white wood around all of this without breaking it open, right? And you can see
Yeah.
there's all
That's
these holes and things that are in there. So, and this particular piece is hollow on the inside. This was hollow as well on the inside, although it's quite solid wood. And then you'll have more solid chips, things like this, things like this. We'll get to a little more show and tell in a little bit. Uh, so
right.
the rarity is that it's an infection in the tree. Both there's a lot of discussion over the age of the tree, the age of the infection, which is more important. I would argue that both are important the same way that older people, as they as they run across any kind of adversity, approach adversity differently than a young person does. So agarwood is a
Right.
formation in a tree that is the result of the immune system of the tree responding to some type of stressor on the plant. Most people will say it's a fungal infection, but I'm kind of torn if it's only a fungal infection, because you have insect, type of stuff, you have animal actions, you have uh, weather, lightning strikes and broken trees. I mean, go out into your backyard, into the wilderness, and look at trees, and they break and fracture, and there's all kinds of stressors that are put on the tree.
Mm-hmm.
And that exposure, the tree starts to resonate. So the tree itself, the wood is pretty white. It's kind of like a really lightly creamy white. And then it starts to form these off-white, moving towards black infections within the tree, which we then cut and then carve away to get the infection. So this is actually an immune response, and the wood becomes resonated. And there's both oil and resin. This is getting really technical. We don't have to jump into everything. There's both oil and
Right.
resin. One thing, get a little frog in my throat here as I'm talking. One thing that sets Kiara apart is that it's a high oil content as opposed to a resin content. And
Okay.
we were talking previously about how Japanese will grade wood, and usually there's a very high oil to resin ratio, whereas in Arab grading systems, it tends to be more about the resin content, although also about oil. But I think in their market, it's more important to have resin. In Japanese market, it's more important to have oil. Of course, if it's oil and resin content, it's great. And part of one of the simple ways you can check for a high oil content ratio is if the wood is aromatic at room temp. And so, like these
Okay.
kinds of pieces are highly aromatic at room temp. I have a whole jar of these things that even when you take the lid off, like it punches you in the face. These are so incredibly aromatic. And this particular tree was one that was it was just a dead tree, and so the wood was carved out of this dead tree, very obviously infected, and it's quite interesting. So this is a long way of me saying, in the wild, they'll say somewhere between 6 and 10% of trees begin to form agarwood. Okay, so only 6 to 10% of the
Okay.
trees in the wild, and even then, there's ranging of age and resonation of tree. And so even though 6 to 10% of trees in the wild will have agarwood, that doesn't mean that there's a whole host of agarwood that's pulled out of the trees. And so even then you kind of have to gauge how resonated the tree is. Now, I bring
Mm-hmm.
that up because when you talk about Kiara would exist in roughly 1 to 10% of that 6 to 10% of trees, so it's even
Mm-hmm.
more rare. And then something else that I would say is that all Kiara is agarwood, very little agarwood is Kiara.
Right.
Okay, and
Mm-hmm.
so that's kind of starts to coalesce how rare the material is, and it helps you to understand why these things are so expensive. And then with that said, when we say Kinam or
Mm-hmm.
Kiara, so Kinam tends to be a geolocation. We talked about this in the last talk, where Japanese would say it's from Shem, which is kind of a geographical reference to a kingdom that hasn't existed in 5 centuries. Either the Shem or the Champa Empire, okay, which would have been parts of Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, pretty much all of Vietnam, parts of southern China. Depending on different maps you look at, there's kind of different areas that encompass. But Japanese would all say that there's a particular scent profile that belongs to Shem. And so anytime you have Shem wood, it's that scent profile. And they might even differentiate Shem scent from Vietnam scent. This is when you talk to somebody who kind of really knows what they're talking about, and they might say, "This is Vietnam. This is Shem."
Mm.
There's like a myriad number of scents that they get, scents like odor profiles, and that's kind of how they end up classifying things. Hopefully, I imagine for somebody who knows nothing about this is a little confusing. So stick with us. We'll try to get into this a little bit more.
Right.
So that Kinam I was telling you is a bit of a geolocation. So in Vietnamese, Ki is that particular type of formation, and then the Nam in Kinam is a reference to Vietnam. And
Right.
so when you see in today's market Kinam, it should be from Vietnam. Now, that word gets used very loosely and starts to be applied to other regions to a particular type of formation. That type of formation would be that same type of Kinam that we're referring to, or at least an odor profile that kind of captures a high percentage of that facet of sense that you get from Kinam. And then Kiara, which is the Japanese term, it's the same ki in Kinam, and then the Kiara is just a reference to that particular type of wood. And even in the Japanese market, I would say that a good deal of wood that is not necessarily it's not necessarily technically Kinam, but it has a very close odor profile that still may get sold as Kiara, which I think
Mm.
people who are sticklers for rules kind of freak out about. But you have to remember, it's about encapsulating the scent profile. It's not about checking like a technical box. If that makes sense.
Right.
So this
Hmm.
is this is just some classification stuff, and so all all Kenam is agarwood. Very little agarwood is Kenam, and that helps to explain why, as agarwood can be astronomically priced, it helps you to explain the really stratospheric prices that Kenam can get. Was that a long way of explaining your question? Hopefully,
No, no,
I touched
I
on
think
it.
that's good actually. Kind of covered all the bases because, yeah, these are kind of dense terms that get thrown around a lot, but they actually do have fairly clear meanings and applications, which that leads me to kind of the next logical question is if the Japanese are using the term Kiara to grade and signify a particular profile, right, or a particular scent pattern, kind of how would you describe that actual scent profile and like what are they looking for versus just kind of regular agarwood? Because at least in my experience, right, I've tried some really nice woods from Vietnam, right, and I can kind of be like, this is at least in my mind, I can be like, yeah, this is about 80% or maybe 60, 70% of like a Kinam profile. It's just missing a few parts. But I'm like, if we added a few other things on top of this, I could see how these things could actually turn out to be that. And kind of one thing I've played around with for myself is taking some of the cultivated Kinam that's readily available and pretty cheap, but actually putting it on my burner and using say like 80-90% of a high grade Vietnam wood and then put a little bit of the cultivated on there and it kind of like
Bridges the gap.
slightly exactly kind of fills in some of the gaps. So that's just kind of a side thing I've been playing around with. So if you could kind of explain a little bit more about what the actual aroma profile that they're looking for, because I know you have a ton of pieces there. So
Right.
I'm kind of just curious if you could explain that.
So to answer your question, I would say that there's a couple stages that we have to lay groundwork for the entire complete meaning to make sense. So the first thing you mentioned, the plantation or the cultivated Kenam that I would say is that for people who really know Kenam, I would say that cultivated Kenam is more of an agarwood plus than it is a cultivated Kenam. It's kind of
Yeah.
like really good agarwood,
Yep.
and it's agarwood plus. Like it has some of those kind of
100%.
dynamic facets. But when you compare it
Yep.
side by side to Kenam, I think it's gonna like true wild stuff. It's gonna disappoint. And so in my mind, when I
100%. Yeah.
smell it, thinking of it as an agarwood plus, I'm like, okay, this is a great deal. When I try to think
Hmm.
of it as Kenam, I'm like, man, I'm disappointed. It doesn't matter what the price is. And so
Exactly. Yeah.
I think that's a good differentiation, point too, is that I think it's more of an agarwood plus and less of a Kenam minus, if that
Yep.
makes sense. So that's the first thing I'll say.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
the next thing I'll say when it comes to classifying these things, modern day, you can look under a microscope or something that like enhances uh, how close you can get to looking at the resin, and you can look at the resin formation. And the resin
Hmm.
formation, it has a particular type of resin formation And the thing that's dangerous here is that there are agarwoods that are better classified as agarwood plus than they are true Kinam that have those types of resin formations. And I think that
Okay.
this is true as you start to expand out of that Sham area, especially as you get into parts of Indonesia. People talk about like a Brunei Kinam. If you look under a microscope, it looks like Kinam, but when you smell it, it's not quite like Vietnamese or Sham Kinam profile. It gets very close. And so one of
Yeah.
those that you could say from a technical sense is the actual type of resin formation, which again, it's very oily, and we were talking about the difference of resin and oil, and then it has a high oil content. So woods with a very high oil
Hmm.
content, as that oil reaches a particular type of maturity, it starts to smell kind of kinamic. And
Mm.
again, that's another term that a lot of people just kind of throw around, and people will be like, "Oh, it's very kinamic," and I kind of end up rolling my eyes because everything starts to smell kinamic when you're somebody selling stuff. If,
Yeah.
if you're not careful with those terms, and so it kind of
Hmm.
drives me a little nuts. So that's the first thing. The second
Hmm.
thing is that if you're talking about, again, from a Japanese perspective, you've got the Rikoku Gomi, which are like the five flavors.
Hmm.
And if you think about like the 5 point star that you see, or the five elements, it's like salty, sweet, sour, pungent. What am I leaving out? Salty, sweet, sour, pungent, and
Bitter.
spicy. Which one am I leaving out? I should know
Bitter.
here. Bitter. There you go. And bitter is the most
Yeah.
important because Kinam should be bitter.
Yeah.
Uh, and so part of it is you have to understand what those five flavors mean. And they have some correspondence to taste, but in Chinese medicine, the five flavors are directional. And so
Mm.
pungent or spicy is dispersing, the same way that soap into oily water disperses. So it has a way of breaking up and dispersing qi. The sour flavor moves qi inwards. So it
Hmm.
moves things from the outside and then accumulates fluid. The same way that if you bite into a lemon, which is very
Yeah.
sour, you get that puckering sensation. There's a lot of
Exactly.
saliva, like a lot of fluid that accumulates, but also that puckering, it has an inward movement. So the sour flavor is directionally inward moving and accumulates fluid.
Hmm.
Bitter, as we mentioned, Kinam Kiara is bitter, and the bitter flavor goes to the heart. So agarwood in general, we say warms the stomach and kidneys, whereas Kinam drains heat from the heart, and this is one of the things that makes it an invaluable medicine. And we had talked previously that agarwood is consumed largely as incense, and then also in terms of oil distillation, but Kinam
Hmm.
is most highly used as medicine, and it's medicine
Mm.
for the heart. And it joins a rare class of materials that clears heat from the heart. And when we say clears heat from the heart, we would say that it is downward descending and helps to clear excess heat from the heart. And so it makes it a rare and valuable medicinal in terms of Chinese medicine, and in Japan it'd be Kampo medicine, but just like Chinese medicine in general, for the
Hmm.
function that it has. So when you're talking about the five flavors, you're talking about directional action of movement. And that's
Hmm.
important because Kinam should have all five flavors. It should do all five things from a
Okay.
medical perspective. The most strongly acting is being the bitterness that has a downward moving action and helps to clear heat from the heart. And so, strangely enough, in terms of medicine, Kinam tends to be used in acute heart condition stuff. So if you look at a lot of the Chinese medical formulas, a lot of times it'll be used with musk and like Jocko and things like this. It'll also be used with porcupine stone, which is a type of stomach formation that happens in porcupines. Porcupines most prolifically, but in other types of animals as well. And then it'll also be used with gallstone, usually like cow gallstone, ox gall, and a number of other
Mm.
materials that help to revive, resuscitate the heart, or the Shen, which is talking about like the Shen spirit, which we say is seated in the heart. Now, of course, there's tons and tons of formulas. There's not just one thing, one action, and you have to start thinking about Kinam as a component, not the whole formula. The same way that chicken
Right.
is material that goes into a multitude of different dishes. You can have tons of chicken dishes
Right.
with tons of flavors. The same thing in Chinese medicine. It's not one herb, one formula. It's one herb is a component of a multitude of different formulas, and then the functions of those
Right.
formulas depend on the other components in the composition and the action that's trying to be garnered there. So again, that was kind of a stepwise way of saying Kenam is a particular type of formation. If you look at the resin, it has a particular type of look. It has a particular
Mm-hmm.
type of feel. If you look at the five flavors, it should have all five flavors, most predominantly the flavor of bitterness, which clears heat from the heart. Uh, some people will say that if you chew on Kenam, it'll make the tongue numb. And I have a little bit of a problem with that as well. And the reason is
Right.
that so I'll ask you this from a Chinese medicine
Sure.
perspective. What does it mean when an herb makes your tongue go numb, or it has a numbing sensation?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a good question.
There is an element of toxicity with the herb,
Right.
and so if the herb has a so toxic in Chinese medicine means something different than in English. But when you're talking about the
Sure.
toxicity of an herb, that that usually kind of correlates to how we talk about in Western medicine. And so herbs that have a toxic component, if you chew on it, it'll make your tongue numb. And then you have
Mm.
to powder, you have to process the herb so that that numbing sensation goes away. We say this, we see
Okay, I
the
see.
same
Yeah.
thing in like huajiao and like in Chinese cooking. If you're eating hot pot, there's like a numbing
Yeah.
sensation from one of the peppers. It's that same kind
Exactly.
of
Yeah.
sensation. Now, the reason I bring that up is that most people will use the tongue numbing as the way of testing if something is Kinam, and I argue that it's not true because part of it has to do with you. If your body
Right.
is in a particular condition, it may numb your tongue, and even regular agarwood can numb your tongue in that regard, as can a number, multitude of
Yep.
other herbs. And so, if you
Right.
if your body, if your heart in particular, is in a relatively good condition with no heat needing to be cleared, and there's a couple other things, you might actually taste Kinam, and it does not make your tongue numb. And so, it's
Mm.
not a clear way of saying this is Kinam. And I would
Right.
also say you respond if it is numbing. It probably means as an herb, it's going to be especially good for you because you need it.
Mm.
Uh, in part, you can tell because of the numbing of your tongue. And so
Right.
that's another physical property that may or may not necessarily be present. And it's not a surefire way to tell if something is Kinam or not. And I'll even tell you, it's
Yeah.
like I'll have the same piece that sometimes I may chew on a little piece. I cut off a little piece and I chew on it. Sometimes it makes my
Mm-hmm.
tongue numb. Sometimes it doesn't. And the difference is not the wood. It's the same piece of wood. The difference is me and the condition that I'm in when I'm tasting the herb.
Mm-hmm.
That makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, we were talking about quinine as medicine and for the heart. There's actually a friend of mine who had one of their friends who was staying with them and visiting, and my friend's friend, his wife or girlfriend or something, was from China, and she had on a necklace that was basically just a piece of quinine over her chest. And because my friend had hung out with me, he kind of roughly knew, like, oh, I think that's agarwood. Like that's random. That's crazy. I don't really see people with just pieces of agarwood around their neck. And she was like, oh yeah, like I have maybe some kind of irregular heartbeat or some kind of heart condition, and she wore the Kinam as a pendant to basically correct and balance out her heart. So for her, it was explicitly medicinal. And my
Medicinal,
friend
yeah.
was just kind of blown away because he didn't know about all this stuff, and he just kind of loosely knew about it or heard about it from hanging out with me. So he told me about it, and I was like, oh, it is. I mean, I'd heard it's used as medicine, but I'd never actually seen or met someone that was literally doing it.
So
So that was,
Yeah, that's cool, and that brings up a good point. And you had asked
Mm-hmm.
that we talk about it. Maybe I'm jumping the gun a little bit, but you were asking about
Uh-huh.
agarwood beads before we started filming. Nice, big, solid,
Sure,
sinking
yeah.
stuff. Okay.
Right.
Now, a lot of people see these and they think in terms of like religious use. Both in Buddhism and also in Islam, they use prayer beads. The
Mm-hmm.
practice. It's funny that we were talking about this. There's a Muslim guy that I was talking to earlier today, and he was saying that it's interesting that Buddhism is the only other religion he can think of, aside from Islam, that uses prayer beads. And I said, well, it's only half true, and the Islamic practice is borrowed from Buddhism by way of Christianity. And so when you think of like a Catholic rosary beads,
Mm.
so around 70 A.D., if I'm not mistaken, there were a bunch of Christian missionaries that made their way into Asia, and around
Okay.
the first century, those missionaries started coming back, and some of what they brought with them, on top of herbs and some practices from Buddhism, were beads, and this is where the
Mm.
Catholic practice of using beads, rosary beads, came from. Rosaries have 108 beads, the same way that 108 bead mala has 108 beads, and then you use those to pray your way through. And then, so in the East, they would use sandalwood and agarwood and other woods like this. As they made their way back to the Middle East, the practice of compounding resin with rose water and some other herbs. That's where the term rosary comes from, is because it would smell like sweet roses.
Ah.
And so that practice was later picked up by Muslims when Islam came into existence. And so that practice is actually a Buddhist practice that came to Islam by way of Christianity from missionaries going into Asia and coming back, sometime in around the first century AD. So uh, when you talk about medicine, I bring this
Right.
up because when I talk to a lot of people in the East, Muslims will usually use these strictly for prayer, but when I talk to a lot of folks in the East that wear beads, they'll tell you that it's not just about prayer, it's not just about scent, but your body actually kind of absorbs a microdose by wearing the
Yep.
beads. And so there's oil from the wood and the fragrance that comes out, sure, and you can smell it in the heat, but then also it's rubbing onto your skin and you're absorbing it into your skin. And so a lot of
Yep.
Asians that I know actually wear beads more as a medical thing than they do as a spiritual thing. And it's that same thing, like your friend is saying. She's got a piece of wood that she wears over her heart, and somehow it helps her heart. That's the somehow. The somehow is that the fragrance her body is absorbing from it, from contact with it, and it's going to help.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty insane story, by the way, about how that they all came full circle. But yeah, I mean
And it's funny that it
that
just
makes a
happened
lot of
today.
sense.
It was just today,
What's that?
2 hours ago, before we
Oh.
were filming. I was talking with this customer of mine, and the conversation of beads came up.
Ah, okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the only thing I would say is I just wish the cost of beads was a little more accessible these days, or I wish I would have gotten into buying beads and stuff maybe 10 years ago before
Before it got too
the
crazy,
market absolutely exploded.
you want to talk about part of the expense,
Uh-huh.
like why they cost so much. So notice that this is not solid, right? It's empty in
Yeah,
the middle,
exactly.
right?
Yeah.
This is not solid. This is, big insect formation. It's so the thing
Right.
is that you need to have very solid wood of a certain size to be able to make beads. And so usually we talk
Yeah,
about
it's
bead grade wood, okay, as a type of
yep.
thing. And usually bead grade woods are more valued in the East than they are in the Gulf market. Now the other thing
Mm.
is that for every bead that you make, for every 1 gram of bead, you generally need 5 to
Yeah.
6 grams of wood. And so
Wow.
if you're making a 20-gram bracelet,
Yeah.
you might need somewhere around 100 to 150 grams of wood. If it's a 5 to 1, 5 grams for every bead. And the reason is that just like with this piece,
Mm-hmm.
it's like this is not something that you'd be carving out of, but you can see the shapes that these come from.
Yeah.
If you're trying to carve something like this, the whole piece might not be viable for making wood. And then also you have to carve away all the wood around it. And so you tend to lose 5 or 6 grams
For
of
sure.
wood for every 1 gram that gets made into a bead. And so that
Yeah.
helps to that helps to explain the expense. A lot of times people don't understand. They're like, I'm just buying, a 20-gram bracelet. Why is it so expensive? It's like, well, it took 100 grams of wood, 150 grams of wood to make it. And so that's kind of the missing link in why people
Yeah.
don't understand the expense of beads. And then, of course, the higher grade of wood being used, the more expensive. And then also, certain regions are more valued than others.
Right.
So that's also part of the expense. And so some of it's a little objective, some of it is subjective, and then some of it is just the reality of the quantity that's needed to make it happen.
Yeah, for sure. I wonder if since you talked about the different kind of five flavors or properties of Kiara and Kinam, I wonder if you might just talk a little bit about the actual kind of perceived scent profile, at least from your opinion and your experience, because obviously people will all might smell it a little differently, but I guess just to give people maybe a little more of like a kind of a tangible, relatable thing, right? And kind of clear up like what Kiara might sort of possibly, hopefully smell like versus what people were just trying to be like, oh yeah, this is kenomic. Oh yeah, this has kenom notes, which, so many people are saying with perfumes now that are apparently kenomic and everything across the board in terms of the game, which to be totally honest, I'm not going to name any names from companies, but I've bought or not bought them, but I've tried samples of a lot of those, and they don't resemble anything remotely. They don't resemble the actual aromatic profile of Kenam, but people are saying they're kenomic because it like maybe it numbs your nose, or it has like a cinnamon tincture with a vanilla tincture, so it has like this numbing, sweet, cooling quality that's trying to sort of kind of mimic Kiara, like these different things. So it's like I get the idea, but when you actually smell it, your brain is just like, this is just cinnamon and vanilla with agarwood. It's not, this is not Kiara, and it's not worth, like $2,000 a bottle. Like I get it, but come on.
Right. So
So,
so let me preface your question with an example that I give usually with a lot of my uh, first treatment patients when they first come in. So a lot of people when they come in have all these questions about Chinese medicine, and without getting into talking about Chinese medicine, it's safe to say that the concept, the word might translate into English, but the concept does not. And so there's
right.
a lot of missing context.
Hmm.
And the thing that I'll usually say to my patients is the challenge that I face is that I live in a world where I know what it means, you don't. And the best analogy I have for that is what does a strawberry taste like? Because you've never had to put words to what a strawberry tastes like because not only have you tasted a strawberry, but everyone you know has tasted a strawberry. And so you just say strawberry, and people are like, yeah, I know what that is. And so then I'll
Yep.
have them go through a little exercise. Uh, Tell me what a strawberry, like, talk to me about the qualities of a strawberry. Well, it's red. Okay, well, apples are red. Does it
Mm.
taste like an apple? No. It's a fruit. Okay, bananas are fruits. Does it taste like a banana? No. It has seeds.
Right.
Like, that's the literal definition of a fruit. So anything with seeds
Yeah.
is a fruit.
Right. Right.
You can see a picture of it, but if you've never tasted it, you still don't know what it tastes like.
Yep.
It's kind of sweet. It's kind of sour. It tastes like, it's like people go through all of this, and I'm like, okay, no one would know what a strawberry tastes like based on what you've told me. And the same is true
Yeah.
about Chinese medicine. It's hard to explain Chinese medicine until you've experienced it. And the only way to really know what a strawberry tastes like is to eat one. I preface that
Right.
to
Right.
say
Right.
that Kinam is kind of the same way. You can talk about it, but if you've never smelled agarwood, it's
Sure.
hard to describe what it smells like. And if you've never smelled Kinam, it's hard to describe what it smells like. But just like a strawberry, once you've tasted a strawberry, you recognize it when you taste it in other things.
Right. Right.
And the best way to understand what Kinam smells like is to spend the money to buy the real thing and learn the scent, because you'll always recognize it. Once you know it, you know it. It's hard to just
Right,
read
right,
the words on pages or listen to a podcast with two really cool guys who just had their haircuts and understand what it's going to smell like. With that
right,
said,
right, right.
with that said, remember how I said all Kinam is agarwood, but not all agarwood is Kinam.
Yeah,
Kinam
exactly.
does smell like agarwood, but it smells like agarwood with extra oomph. And
Mm,
you were saying when something smells kinamic, there can be a little bit of a minty kind of medicinal kind of scent to it. Sometimes it can be a little floral smelling. And I'm not talking about like sticking a rose or jasmine up your nose kind of floral. It's like a floral tone to it, a texture to it that's kind of floral. It can smell a little sweet. It can smell a little bitter. Now, here's something else that's worth mentioning. My better half is Japanese. That was an accident, was not planned. And strangely enough, if my name is JK, her name is K. Also not planned. Well, I tell people that we planned it that way. Um, One thing that we see all the time and we have a lot of fun with, and this is something that I get from Chinese medicine as well, is that
hmm.
we're different ethnicities, and actually our noses, our eyes, and our ears pick up different tones uh,
Right.
between ethnicities. And so Japanese eyes are said to actually see the widest color spectrum out of all people, especially in the blue range. This is part of the reason why there's so many blues that are used in the indigo range. They pick up contrasts in blue that you and I as Westerners, as white Westerners, our eyes don't pick up those things, and they'll hear tone
Mm,
qualities as well that we don't necessarily hear. Um, their noses will pick up scents that we don't necessarily pick up. And so when you have Japanese, Asian people in general, but Japanese especially, smell
hmm.
Kiara, they'll tell you that it's very bitter smelling. When I smell
Mm.
Kiara, it doesn't smell bitter to me. And so telling people that there's a bitterness to it is kind of pointless if you're not a yellow Asian, because I don't think that we necessarily
Yeah,
perceive that scent in the same way that they do. And so
that makes
there's a
sense.
bitterness to it, a very strong bitterness to it, that I usually pick up as smelling kind of sweet and spicy, but they would say is bitter.
Mm.
And so this is also one of those things, kind of like the strawberry, where talking about it is a little pointless if you haven't tasted it.
Right, right.
And even then, just like we were talking about previously with wines and whiskey and other things like this, sometimes you also have to develop your palate. And I would also say from a Chinese medicine perspective, or maybe even a meditation perspective, if your senses are all gunked up, you're not going to perceive these things
Exactly.
clearly anyway. And so there's also a refinement of spirit or refinement of body. You have to clean yourself out to be able
Hmm.
for your sense organs to pick these things up accurately. And so if you're not in the best of health, I would also say that maybe you don't perceive the scent as clearly as you could be perceiving it.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. I think for me, I definitely, from my experience, I had to develop a palate as well. And then I've even noticed differences based on my mood or my stress levels. And then definitely, as my nervous system opened up and relaxed, like I pick up way more than I did previously. Stuff that I almost can't even really classify. It's just this a whole kind of more, just like a delicate kind of profile that it has. That's not really, it's quite as solid or quite as in your face, let's say. Because I think sometimes with a lot of the Kinam that I've smelled, sometimes the like numbing quality, that like bitter, I guess numbing quality, I guess that's like really paramount. But I think it's, again, especially if it's something that's not from our culture, it's something that's completely foreign to us. It's like, how can you understand and relate to something you've completely never experienced and have absolutely no context for? That's a really difficult thing to grasp. And I think that's, in some ways, that's sort of the blessing and the curse of this whole genre in general, because like kind of like we were saying last time, one of the first things you bought as like a big purchase was ended up being like a fat bag of Kiara, which at the time you didn't even really realize it, and the guy selling it to you didn't even really realize it. But that can also go the other way, where people are buying total garbage and they're thinking it's great because they just kind of don't know or never develop the quality. And I think this also leads to what you were saying about cleaning out your system. And especially as us, as modern people in the West, just the amount of chemicals and synthetic aromas that people are, your average person is just completely immersed in from head to toe, 24/7, 365, is just absolutely mind boggling. And just as a caveat, I don't know if people realize that that stuff is not regulated in the same way that like food and other things are regulated. And why it's important is that our skin is a really big organ of absorption and elimination. So that ties into what we were saying earlier about, you know, the people wearing beads or wearing pendants, things like that. So a lot of the artificial chemicals and aromas that people are used to are actually verified and known neurotoxins and carcinogens. So if you're spending, I don't know, 20, 30, 40, 50 years of your life bathing in that stuff from head to toe and burning like Glade plugins and all this synthetic aromas, this is kind of what we're talking about for detoxing. Like all that stuff has to go if you want to enjoy, you know, natural aromatics and actually get the most bang for your buck. Because I think that stuff just clogs up your lymphatic system, kind of just completely numbs out your palate. And at least for me, I noticed a massive benefit from just getting rid of all of that stuff, and then I just got way more sensitive to aroma, but also flavor in general. And it was a similar process that I had to go through when I got really interested in expensive teas. I basically just stopped eating garlic, stopped eating onions, stopped eating like anything at all that was too aggressive in terms of a flavor profile, because that stuff lingers and kind of builds and kind of just at a certain point kind of numbs you out. It's kind of also like, I think of it, if you go to a really loud concert and the music's just blaring and it's like reverberating through your body, eventually like that kind of just numbs you out a little bit because your nervous system just can't really take it. So then if you go to like, I don't know, an acoustic classical performance, like a lot of it's probably just gonna not really hit that way. So it's just kind of some random stuff that came to mind, but also illustrates kind of a lot of what we're talking about. And I think it's particularly important because Kiara is not cheap. It's not necessarily that easily available. I mean, it is actually pretty easily available now because we have people like yourself who have it on your shop, you know, make it easy. But I mean, unless you're just rolling in dough and $1,500 is nothing to you, then you might want to spend some time to invest in yourself so that you can actually get the most out of it. Which kind of leads me to really a great question that I think probably a lot of people will ask is, I mean, is it worth it? Like, I mean, really, I mean, come on. If it can be $1,500 a gram or more, and it's so rare, it's so expensive, it's so prized, like, is that actually I mean, I know obviously part of it is it depends. There's obviously no clear cut answer, of course, but I'm just saying to qualify it, is it just the fact that it's so rare and scarce and there's so many people that want it now, so the price just shot up? Is it genuinely something that's, you know, psychoactive and truly transformative for people? Or is it just something like a status symbol? Or is it like, oh, that's expensive, I have money, I'll take it? And again, I'm sure it's all of the above, but I'd like for you to maybe just expand on maybe each of those and share some insight.
Yeah, I would say yes, all of those. Um,
Yeah.
I would say that agarwood in general can be highly psychoactive. You know, a lot of
Yep.
people will smell agarwood for the first time and have like crazy experiences with it. and I know I did when
Mm.
I first started getting like really good quality stuff in the beginning, because as I had explained previously, when I was in med school and I started realizing in this kind of like all this pharmacy compounding education I was getting my hands on all these herbs, when I started buying really high grade stuff, it was like how come everything feels so medically active? Like I was having responses, kind of reactions to everything. And it
Yep.
wasn't just agarwood. I mean, anything I could get my hands on, it was like deep and profound. It was no longer just scent. There was something
Yep.
happening to me and in me that was not happening previously. And when you start looking, like in the classification of herbs in Chinese medicine, and you have all these grades, that's something else that people don't realize is that you can say, okay, cinnamon, and then there's
Yeah.
like grades of cinnamon, but then there's like cinnamon from certain areas, and then there's cinnamon
Yep.
from certain ages of trees. It's
Yep.
like the the compounds that are in something begin to affect you differently than in kind of like standard food grade stuff. And
Yep.
so that would be the first thing that I would say is that as you get better and better quality stuff, especially particular species, particular things from very specific areas, they can impact you in different ways. And for somebody who notices those kinds of details, I would say yes, it's worth it. The same way that in the tea world, is drinking tea that's
Mm.
10 or 15 or $50 a gram worth it? Well, I mean, maybe it's not a
Right.
daily worth it, but it's definitely worth it on occasion. And
Right.
I would also say, in terms of medicine, if you're looking at this as kind of a meditative thing, something that you're really trying to do, that more than just like I'm burning it off in the corner and I smell it, then yes, I'd say it's
Yeah.
worth it in that regard. I would even say that high grade agarwood of a particular quality, things that have actual Kinamic facets, I would
Mm-hmm.
say that that's worth it, and that would also be a good way of kind of saving some money, as going, like you were saying, 80% of the way there. You kind of you get most of what you need, not necessarily all of it, but you get most of it. Um, I would also say that there's a difference between kind of those daily wears, daily burns, as opposed to more special occasion.
Right.
I don't have a Kodo cup around here, but let's pretend that this is a Kodo cup, and the way that they're breathing and smelling it. You can have 1 gram of Kinam. You can stretch out into 10, 15, 50 sessions. And so
Or
if you
more, for
amortize it
sure.
over that way, if you spend $1,500 on a gram of something, but you get 20 sessions out of it, and it's $35 a session, all of a sudden that
Right.
becomes pretty feasible every once in a while. It's a big commitment up front, but then you get to use it a bunch of times. If you get 50 uses out of it, and it's costing you 15 or $20 a session, and each session you draw out to be 2 or 3 hours, all of a sudden that starts to get really feasible. And I would also argue, notice in both the Gulf and also in the East, agarwood
Yep.
is, yes, used for personal enjoyment, but it's oftentimes used in a setting with multiple people. And so if you
Mm-hmm.
have a Kodo cup with a little slice of Kinam on it and you're passing this between 5 or 6 people, that's a lot of bang for your buck. And then
Right.
also it's ambiently in the air, so it's like not only are you breathing it like this, right up on your nose, but you're breathing it even when someone else is using it. The same way that if you're in a place and they're chucking chips of charcoal, sorry, if they're chucking chips on charcoal, it's fragrancing the whole space. You could have 100 people in the room breathing from that one piece of wood, and all of a sudden it becomes very
Right.
feasible to do that if that's how you're looking at using it. And so, in that regard, you can use very expensive medicine, very expensive wood, in a very inexpensive kind of manner. And I'll give you one other example. I'll move it already. Um, well, this is empty, but say you have an empty bottle and you have oil, and it's a $500 bottle of
Uh-huh.
oil. Okay, but if
Right.
you're going crazy and you're swiping, arms and ears and chin, and this bottle's going to go pretty fast. But if you use it like I do,
Yep.
or a lot of my customers do, you'll use a dot, just a dot.
Yep.
and you might get
Yep.
two or three or 350 applications out of this. So if
Yep.
this was $500 and you got 10 uses out of it, that's $50 a use. But if this was $500 and you get 300 uses out of it, or 250 uses out of it, that's like $2 a use,
Exactly.
right? And so all of a sudden that $500 expense is only $2, and you wear it all day and it smells, all day. It's impacting you all day long. All of a sudden those become really feasible expenses. Where yes, it's a lot to
Yeah.
buy the bottle, but then you may get years of use out of it. And the same is true for buying a piece of wood. Sure, you might spend a couple grand on this piece of wood, but you know, if you're being frugal, this will last you the rest of your life.
Yeah. No, I mean,
And
especially
so,
nowadays with especially with the sub burner, the subatism that you
yeah,
sell,
subatomisms, yeah,
um, and then and then also some of the more like Asian style, like low temp digital heaters. I
yeah,
mean, I've had tiny little dustings of Kiara on those things that last for weeks.
hours, yeah,
Maybe
hours.
yeah, because like maybe I'll use it, a couple hours a day, spike it, low temp, sit with it, okay, put it away, bring it back tomorrow, and it just keeps going and going and going. So if you're using them in that way, it lasts a really long time.
Yeah, and I'd even argue that after you use it on electric, you can still toss it on charcoal and kind of squeeze some blood out of the stone. So when you ask, is it worth it? I would say that there are a lot of ways that you can make it worth it.
Right.
You can make the expense worth it. And this is part of the reason why, with my own customers, I have a really wide array of products, and I try to hit a whole bunch of different price points, in part
Yep.
because, my customers are all kinds of people. They're from all over the world. They have all kinds of different budgets. They have all kinds of different, wants and needs. And so I'm trying my best to put a smile on everybody's face, not just a few people's faces.
Right.
And then I offer different sizes, sample sizes, and even with the woods, like expensive stuff, I cut down to small scale so that you can still afford to get a taste. Even if you're not buying big chunks like this, you can get slices of things so that you can at least get a taste and educate your nose, and you can still be part of the game. I'm trying to
Yeah.
de-exclusivize the game. Remember, I was saying, we're like, at the end of the day,
Right.
we're playing with king shit. Like this, at no
Yeah.
time in history has it been more accessible than now to the common man.
Right.
Me and you being common
Right.
men, maybe me more than you, but so it it it's very tangible to be able to get stuff, and even the Kiara that I have in the shop, I offer in small enough increments so that you're just spending, a couple $100, a little over $100, to be able to get
Yep.
something that should last you at least several sessions. And if you're using this like the Japanese do, like you were talking about with the subatisms and some of the other electrics, when you go and you use these really expensive woods, they use a rice grain size.
If even that sometimes, for me
Think
anyways.
about a rice grain. And so when you have 1 gram of wood, you can get easily at least 20 rice grains out of a gram of wood.
Yep.
And as you said, you can stretch this out. I was saying over hours, but I mean, realistically, you can stretch out that piece of wood over days. And then at the end of it, toss it on a little piece of charcoal, and then you also get that hit.
Yep. Or just turn the temp up on your burner, because that's what I usually do. Start on a really low temp and then just gradually, work it, coax more out of it. Exactly. And then, when it's on its last legs, just like, all right, let's see what we can get out of it. But yeah, I think you touched on a lot of really good points, and it reminded me of a friend of mine who was in Hong Kong and got some herbal formulas there, and basically completely blew her doors off. Versus, she'd taken Chinese herbal formulas before, but she never really felt anything, never really noticed anything. And it really just reiterated the point of the quality of the materials. And she was basically saying that she thinks a lot of the really, really good, at least herbal materials, actually don't leave Hong Kong. They don't leave China. They don't tend to make their way over here maybe in small quantities for certain people that might have the connection, but across the board, like we're not getting. And but she was basically saying that when she was taking it and drinking it, it was like, whoa, something's really happening. Something's really shifting and moving around. It reminded me of exactly like what you were saying once you started getting into the higher grade stuff. And I can say that it's a similar principle, for my products and all the products that I sell. I have a lot of customers that have come to me and be like, I took reishi or cordyceps or whatever. I never really noticed anything. It didn't really do anything. But then I took a quarter teaspoon of yours and I was like, whoa, I'm actually feeling something. And I'm like, well, yeah, that's kind of like, I just try to have my products do what they're supposed to do. Like if reishi is supposed to, I don't know, have this calming effect, then let's have it have the calming effect. Like that's it. And I just mention it because, at least in the herbal world, people get really into biochemistry and having X amount of this chemical, and now that makes it better. But to be totally honest with you, I mean, I've had, some older ginsengs of different types, and I've had some different wild reishi mushrooms that probably from like a biochemical point of view probably didn't have much of anything going on. I bet if you tested them, they would have very low active constituents. And even the way they were prepared and concentrated wasn't necessarily that high, but it's just the quality of the materials that went in there and the preparation made tiny amounts of them be extremely effective and extremely potent. Versus, I've taken reishi extracts that are 80% this constituent or ginsengs that are X amount this ginsenosides, and they just don't really have the actual effect. And I think on one hand, our biochemical point of view is, obviously useful and has its merits and is great for quality control and maybe testing things across batches and whatever. But for the actual felt experience for a lot of these things, I don't think we really have figured that out and really quantified it, especially with things like, Kiara or Kinam or high grade agarwood or even high grade teas, high grade materials in general. It's something. It's a whole other complicated thing that I don't think we exactly have, the best model for, at least in our Western culture as of yet. So I think that's also part of the learning curve with Kiara and Kinam and some of these higher grade woods. And it's like you were saying, you're selling it in, as little as zero point 0.1 of a gram, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it actually is kind of a lot, at least for me, because like I'm using less than a rice grain. I just take a rice grain and then I cut it up with scissors so that it's basically like a little dust, and then I put that on there. And because it's already kind of broken up, you get more out of less, and it
More
just
surface
lasts,
area.
even longer. So that kind of leads me to the next question, which is if you could talk a little bit about as best you can, the qualitative differences in the experience between, let's say, heating it on low temp on like the subatism versus someone who hopefully wouldn't put it on a higher temperature burner. But I will admit this publicly. When I first got started, I did that and I wasted I wasted a lot of expensive Kenam just putting it on. I was like, oh, I'll put it on the edge of the burner where it's not so warm, and it got toasted, and it was not a good situation. But I mean, I experienced it, I smelt it, but it was not really quite the full experience. So that versus like having it in an incense stick form, because I know you also have Kenam incense sticks, and then obviously we talked about beads, and then you can talk a little bit about oil as well, because I mean that one might be not quite as common because there's not very many actual oils that are legitimately distilled from legitimate Kenam material. There's probably not many that have ever really existed because the cost is insane. So yeah, I wonder if you could just talk about some of the differences between each of those forms.
Sure. So you were talking first. Take a step back. You're talking about the constituents, and they talk about
Right, right,
the active ingredients. At least in the
right.
perfume world, there's an understanding that on the one end, quality is gauged by an agreed upon, measurement of certain active compounds.
Yep.
On the flip side of that, usually what gives something its really unique, distinctive, individualistic qualities are all of the minor components, oftentimes which can't even be measured if you were to GC the material. And
Right.
so, it's like sandalwood's a great one, where people look at the alpha and beta santalol,
Mm-hmm.
but when you gauge the quality, you add up all of the santalols, which include all of the minor components that aren't the alpha and beta santalol. And then
Right.
each of those regions have distinctive minor components that may or may not be present in other regions, and then also those are available in different quantities, and so that's what gives each, not only each region but each individual batch, its distinctive qualitative characteristics. Whereas if you were a big company, you're trying to standardize it based on those major
Yeah.
components. And
Right.
like you said, there are herbs that on a lab test might register really high, but they're not all that active. It's usually because they're missing all of, like, the aggregate of all of those minor components.
Yep.
I would say the same is true too. We were talking about wine, whereas in American, people are like, "Oh, red or white,"
Yeah.
and you know, God, when somebody says that, it's the nuance, and the nuance is the different types of grapes, the different soil, the terroir, the region. It's like
Right.
all of these moving pieces that go into making something the unique individual, glass of wine that you're drinking, or bottle of scotch, or oil that you're
Yep.
smelling, whatever it is. It's all of that. It's all that stardust that makes it exciting. So that's the first thing I'd
Yep.
say. The second part of that is, got to think of the best way of saying this. So there are two good examples that I wanted to give you that you made me think of. You were talking about. I have to trip my memory here. What were you saying? What was part of the question? Can you rephrase that to me, because it'll trip
Oh,
my
just
memory?
maybe some of the differences between like heating it on low temp versus experiencing it in an incense stick versus experiencing it in an oil.
Got
Because
it.
you can get it in those different forms, right?
Got it. So, on one of my trips to Japan, we were talking. I had mentioned previously that if you bring your own heater, that goes a
Yeah.
long way of, like, shortening the dance for you to be able to score. Because if you bring your own heater, they at least already, like, you already know some of what you're talking about, and you're serious about it.
Yeah.
So on one of my trips, I had gone to one of these houses with Tanaka. It's funny, my wife was just with Tanaka today. His 80th birthday's coming up. She's in Japan right now, and they got together with one of her sisters for lunch. So it's funny that we're talking about him, because we were just talking about him this morning. So Tanaka and I go to one of these places, and they light up a Kodo cup. They've got the rice ash, the charcoal in there, and the guy's like chipping off little pieces of wood and chucking it in there. And I kept telling him, I'm not getting the nuance. Like, I want to smell
Right.
the nuance. And so at some point, I had him pull out a mica plate, and I started fiddling with that. And he was looking at me like, oh, okay. And this guy was the manager too. So I'm
Okay.
getting really technical on him, and he did not think that I was going to get like this. And then I got so frustrated, I made a Kodo cup. I had him pull out fresh ash. We put charcoal in there. I bury it up. I put the mic on top, and he's looking at me like, and he's looking at Tanaka like, this guy is crazy. And so that's when, like, the next day, my heater I didn't have charged. I came back the next day, brought the heater, and I was like, okay, you smelled it on charcoal, you smelled it on a mica plate, you smelled it on a Kodo cup. Now I want you to smell it on electric, where we can, like, just incrementally heat it up. And this guy is smelling it, and he's like, I haven't smelled anything like this. I didn't notice. And so I'm peeling away the layers. And the thing is that
Yeah.
each of these ways of we would say listening, not smelling the incense, but listening to the incense, because you have to listen to what it says. It speaks. You have
Yep.
to listen to it. You're not smelling it. You're listening to what it's saying.
Yep.
Each of these ways of experiencing it is legitimate and useful and viable for whoever is going about smelling these things.
Mm.
So, with that being said, I'm going to say something that the Japanese say, and I don't want this to come across as judgmental, but they would say that chucking agarwood on charcoal is barbaric. It's an
Yeah.
absolute waste.
Right.
So, head west and you go into the Gulf region, and using
Yep.
agarwood on charcoal is pretty standard. They'll use like thumbnail
Hmm.
size pieces, whereas Japanese are using like a little rice grain. You want to chuck a 1 or 2 gram piece on charcoal? Hey, go for it. And within that culture, it makes sense. And the funny thing is, when I talk to a lot of my golf clients and I try to educate them and say, like, you really need to try these things on an electric. Like, buy one of my subatisms. And they don't want to spend the money. They don't get it. This is my culture. This is how we use it. And I'm like, look, I'm not telling you
Yeah.
that that's not a valid perspective. I'm just telling
Sure.
you you're wasting your money with expensive stuff. And
Yep.
and most of them argue with me, and a few of them, when they do take my word for it and they try it out, they'll be like, God, I've been using agarwood for my whole life, 10, 20, 30, 50 years, and I've never
Yep.
smelled this out of the wood. Like, you mean to tell me that it's been there the whole time? And yeah, sadly.
Yeah.
And I'll have guys that'll go through a kilo of wood a month. That go from using a kilo of wood to maybe going through a couple grams in a
Yep.
month. So
Yeah.
it's like, how much? And then I always kind of joke with them. I'm like, well, since I saved you so much money, how about you start buying more stuff from me? Kind of
Yeah.
nudge, nudge. And yeah, they'll kind of laugh. And part of it is culturally, they'll burn it on the charcoal to fragrance their clothes, to fragrance the space. And
Yeah.
so they need large amounts of smoke, which I totally get. But when you're using really expensive wood, when you're using, you know, when you're using a diminishing resource that it's not necessarily extinct, like will never exist again, but it's more of a logistical extinction. Like, it's probably not going to exist in your lifetime. It doesn't mean that it's gone for good, it just means it's gone for us.
Yeah.
When you start using logistically extinct materials or things on their way to logistical extinction, it's really good to use them as mindfully and as wisely as possible. And for this reason,
Yes.
I think that the Asian way in general, the Japanese way specifically, of kind of Kodo style, using the electric heaters that we make, which are kind of mimicking that Japanese style of indirect low temp heat, is it's a really viable way of stretching out how long expensive rare materials will last. It makes it friendlier on your wallet. All of a sudden, you don't need this. You can start buying, and this is still a big piece. I mean, this is still several grams. You could be getting a
Yeah.
small portion of this, and it'll last you for ages. So it becomes, and then because there's not just one fragrance, there's hundreds,
Right.
thousands of iterations of this. You can start buying lots and lots and lots and lots of different odor profiles, and it becomes much more feasible, much more affordable, and the access to the common man, you and I, buying king shit, kind of,
Yep.
you know, becomes exponential as opposed to, just buying one piece. I mean, even here as you and I talk, like we were talking last time, this famous general, in old Japan having, 135 different pieces of agarwood. And here I am. I mean, I'm just pulling out 5 different pieces just as we talk,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
To be able to have something like this in the past, you know, the average man would not have access to these kinds of things. Everybody can have
No,
access to
not
them
a.
today. And so the feasibility of using an electric, I think, is very
Yeah.
good and opens up a lot of doors. It makes things, uh, it makes the learning curve also much better because you're not just chucking it on charcoal and you've got like 30 seconds before it's all burned up. You can
Yeah.
control the temperature and incremental, and you can really peel away the layers so that you can train your nose, train your senses, and you're also not literally just burning money. That's also kind of a joke
Yeah.
in the industry is that, people be like, people just burn their money. These idiots, they'll spend thousands of dollars to burn their money. That's
Hmm.
literally what I hear from some of the Asian supply chain. They just kind of laugh at people. They're like, I don't understand. Firewood in my country, gold in yours.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something people would want to invest in if they're gonna, jump off into this crazy wild world. Is get yourself a subatism or some kind of small electric heater, and it's again a cost up front, but will save you a lot of time and money and hassle in the long run. And you won't do what I did, which is buy expensive Kiara and then chuck it on a really high heat high heat burner and then just toast it up.
And then you're like, I don't get it.
Yeah, exactly. Or you like what you think you got is only a fraction of what it actually was.
So it's funny. The second story that I have for that is funny too. So first, it's like
Uh-huh.
I go through with this guy, and then eventually bring in the electric, and everybody's like, "Ooh, ah," and I'm like, "You guys been doing this for centuries. You haven't thought about this?" I guess even the manager in the store, I guess they don't do these things. And they had several girls kind of working in back, and working with customers, and in between customers, they're all laughing at me. The huge white guy talking with my elderly second father figure, and the manager, and
Mm-hmm.
everybody's just kind of laughing at me as I do this stuff. The manager's laughing at me. Tanaka's laughing at the manager, laughing at me. I'm laughing at them, laughing at me. You know, I'm okay with being the butt of the joke. Uh,
For sure, yeah.
but it was also a lot of fun because when we did start peeling away the layers,
Mm-hmm.
and we would try these different woods, even the girls who were 10, 15 feet behind me, and we're burning, little tiny pieces of stuff. Even the girls
Right.
behind us were noticing the nuance when we were heating it on electric, even though their
Yep.
noses weren't right over it. They were back there doing
Sure.
other stuff. And every time we would change the wood, they would notice. Even if they weren't looking at us, they could smell it, and everybody would just kind of stop. And it was funny also with customers walking into the store, because they'd walk into the store and they'd just get kind of punched in the face, and everybody'd be like, "What are you guys doing?" And they're like, "Well, the Hakugen down there, the white guy, he's looking at woods."
Uh-huh.
So then I had to deal with random customers laughing at me too.
Sure.
You can tell these are good memories for me. I start telling these stories and I just can't help but laugh. A lot of good memories as I've gone into to meet with a lot of these different companies, and in some cases talk with the owners of the companies. And as much as they know, and I tell people about this myself as well. As much as we know, we don't always know everything. You don't always think of everything. You're always learning
For sure.
something new, and it's fun to have been working in something for so long, and then to be caught off guard with something that you're like, oh,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, also there's just the context of like for us, it's this new, unique, novel, exciting, foreign, amazing, world that we get to explore. And many people have the luxury of spending hours every day reading online and, watching stuff like this and just like massively downloading and trying to get all the information they possibly can. Whereas for some people, just like how we take a lot of stuff for granted in our culture, but for someone else might be like, oh, that's cool. For some of these people, it's like, whatever. It's not that exciting. It's not foreign. It's not exotic. It's not unique. It's this thing, and or maybe it's just their job. They sell a commercial good, and that's it. Whereas we're like total nerds and geeks about every little thing. And I mean, I saw it. Very similar experience with, I went to tea shops around the world, and the people are just like, "How do you know all this crap? Like, what do you do? What are you talking about? Why are you so excited about this?" And they're just like, "It's just tea. Like, what are you doing?" And I'm like, "Yeah, but you don't understand." And I'm like, all excited because I'm like, I'm from a small town in Indiana, and like tea is whatever. And they're just like, this white guy's crazy. But, it's part of the humor. And, they were roasting me as well, which the thing is, like, I don't care. You can make fun of me. You can say anything, whatever. Just let me get access to the good stuff. And I'm fine. I'm not worried about it.
several years ago,
um,
several years ago, my wife and I went out to San Francisco. There's a bunch of good tea companies that are out there. I think we might have been at Red Blossom. And the cool thing about going in there is that they'll have tea sessions for you, so that you can taste a couple different teas. And
Mm.
people talk about being tea drunk.
Yep.
We got tea hammered.
Yeah.
I mean, the two of us were sitting there. We went through 5 or 6 different teas. I bet we were there for 2 hours. The lady who was helping us thought we were so funny because, again, like white people don't walk in there and kind of know anything about it.
Right.
And I mean, we got sloshed. She and I looked at each other at one point, and it was like, "Are you feeling like I'm feeling?" And she was like, "Yeah." We had trouble walking out of there. Um, we had gone to is it Tenren? That's also there's a Tenren location out there. We had gone
Mm.
to Tenren on another day, and the lady that was helping us, my conversational Chinese is not great, but I understand a lot more of it than I speak. And the lady that was
Mm.
helping us, her English was, I don't want to say it was bad, but it wasn't great. And
Right.
when she would I would be like, just say it in Chinese, and she'd say it. And when she'd see that I could understand it, she would just
Ah.
go off and start talking in Chinese. And my wife, who's Japanese, is looking at me like, how the hell are you understanding this? She's like, I
Mm-hmm.
don't believe that you're understanding this. And I'd repeat back to the lady what she said in English, and she's like, yeah, yeah. My wife is looking at me like where did that come from? And like you said, the ability to sit and enjoy something when, as a kid from Indiana, like tea is, Lipton, it's
Sure.
bag tea,
Sure.
it's iced tea, it's, I live in the South. Everything here is sweet tea.
Mm.
For you to open people's eyes and show them that there's so much more to this, so much more fun. And that's why the best analogs to this are things like wine and cheese and whiskey, you know, tea, which in this country people don't tend to know as well. Coffee to an extent, chocolate to an extent. Being able to like get regions and profiles and elevation, and it's like there's all these
Yep.
kind of moving pieces that help with the nuance of something, and then you get to nerd out on it. The best part is that you get to share this with people. Part
Exactly.
of the
Yeah.
fun I have as a vendor is that I ship product out. I've got customers in over 50 countries. I usually ship out to about 35 countries every year. I've got thousands of people, that some people just buy stuff and I never talk to them, but other people, we actually communicate. I mean, when you're writing messages, it's me getting them and responding to you.
Yep.
And it's so much fun for me to talk with these people, which is funny because it's so much that fun for them to be talking to me. I
Yeah.
don't think they realize that it's so much fun for me to be talking to them. And,
Yeah.
and even though we're not face to face and I don't get to see the wide eyes, I mean, I can hear the excitement in the messages that I get when something kind of registers and it clicks and there's an aha moment, and it's just,
Mm.
like I get that in these communications. There's a guy over in, I think he's in Saudi Arabia, who's been grabbing some stuff for me lately. If you're listening to this, you should know who you are. He's been really funny because I think he's originally from the UK. He's been living out there for more than at least 20 years, I think, and he's been buying agarwood products, wood products for a long time. And he's in the Saudi market, so he's buying mainly like local stuff and kind of big Gulf market brands. And then he stumbles across me. He starts buying some stuff, and he's like, "Well, God, if I had known that I could be getting things that smell like this, like I feel like I've wasted the last 20 years." It's the
Right.
same thing that Tanaka said to me, and he's like,
Mm.
"God, my biggest regret is, when he said this, he was late 60s, early 70s. He's like, I've wasted 70 years of my life not knowing that this stuff was like all around me."
Right. Right.
For the last decade or so that he's been enjoying these things, it's been the coolest thing for him, especially the last 3 years of the pandemic. All the fun that we've had.
Yep.
And in Asia they took it even more seriously than we did out here, and so incense, I'd send him packages every month. He was getting woods incense usually from me every month, and he said that was like the biggest joy for he and his wife. They'd sit down, have a glass of wine, and burn incense. He'd wake up to it, he'd go to bed to it, and that was his companion, for a couple of years. And every time he'd get a package, I would never tell him I was sending it either. So it'd show up, and
Ah.
I'd get this like giddy little school kid, message like, "Oh, I got your package," and so there's so much joy that I get out of this. Um,
Mm.
I get yelled at by my wife a lot because I don't think she has joy going to work.
Right.
It drives her nuts that I have fun doing this. And that, yes, work can be tedious. Yes, sometimes I hate it. Yes, sometimes I want to
Yeah.
smack customers upside the head.
Yeah.
Yes, like it can be work, but most of the time it is
Right.
fun. You know, there is a lot of joy that I get out of talking to people. There's a lot of joy that I get from the people that I work with, people
Mm.
that are my employees overseas. Like I have a lot of fun helping people, a lot of fun connecting the dots. Obviously, I had a lot of people tell me after our last talk, they were like, "Brandon is a statue, and you are so animated."
They said
Oh,
I was what?
a statue. You were so like calm and collected, so zen. Compared to
Oh,
me, who's very loud and I move around and I'm excited and there's lots of intonation in my voice, but I'm kind of like this in real life. So as I'm writing
yeah.
you a message, people always tell me after they hear me talk, they're like, "Man, I can
Right.
really hear your tone in your writing." It's funny. We're also both
Yeah,
kind of wearing plum color. We got our hair cut.
I
We
know,
also
man.
managed to be wearing like the same color shirt. We're really on the same wavelength.
I know, man. It's all the Kiara and Kinam just organizing all the fields. I think yeah, I mean what you're saying, it definitely it's an amazing thing and a gift and a luxury to be able to have your livelihood, relatively intertwined with something you genuinely enjoy, and then something that genuinely adds joy to other people's lives and genuinely helps and benefits them. I think it's a really great thing. I can relate similarly, maybe not quite to the same extent, but definitely, you know, been lucky to earn my livelihood from things that I'm passionate and interested in for the last, I don't even remember how long it's been. I haven't had an actual job since like 2006, maybe, or something like that. So however long that's been. Granted, it's been absolutely a grind, a lot of it, but it just, yeah, being able to share something that you are enjoying and you're passionate about with other people and then help them on that journey, it's really a pretty amazing thing and it's a luxury in itself to be able to luxuriously sell luxury goods to other people, basically. So the last thing I kind of wanted to ask you about is you have on your store an actual oil distilled from Kenam. And I think this is not the
Talking.
first one that you've had. But basically, there's a lot of oils that have been on the market over the years that have claimed to be distilled from Kenam, or there's many oils on the market. Yeah, there it is. Just open it, just dump it on yourself. Just take a bath in it. It's fine. But there's a lot of people will throw around the word kenomic, like, oh, this oil is kenomic, this oil has kenomic facets, this oil, blah blah blah, and we won't name any names, but there's people who will routinely use it as like kind of a nomenclature or a marketing tool, and everything is this kind of Kiara and that kind of Kiara and this Kenam and that Kenam, and it's partially why we wanted to have this conversation now is to kind of clear some of that up because it can be confusing to see it just kind of thrown around. And like I said earlier, I can kind of see why people do it and how they get there, but I also don't really think it's the best usage of the term. So I guess long story short, what I'd like to have you discuss a little bit is talk about when people are saying something has a kenomic aspect, what does that actually mean? And then transition that to actually talking a little bit about your actual Kenam oil.
Sure. So there can be a number of different kenomic facets. One of it can be that kind of tingly sensation that some people get, that numbing
Yeah,
tingly sensation. Sometimes it can be a little bit of a minty, and when they say minty, we're not talking about like mint. It's like
right.
a kind of it can be kind of like a camphoraceous medicinal kind of mintiness. But that mintiness,
Yep.
really, what they're referring to is that cooling action.
Mm,
It has kind of a cooling sensation. If you're talking to Asian folks, Asian noses will usually tell you that it's bitter smelling. I don't talk to
mm,
many white folk, people of European descent, that talk about the
Right.
bitterness. But when you talk to yellow
Yeah.
Asians, and I usually differentiate, there's yellow Asians and brown Asians. When you're talking to yellow Asians, they usually talk about the bitterness.
Mm.
Uh, and that, I think, is a facet, kind of a biological facet, just in the slight difference of our ethnicity. As we usually talk about in Chinese medicine, we're all people, we're all human, but
Right.
kind of like dogs, there's like different breeds of dog that have different
Sure.
kind of facets of personality that come out, and they've got fine-tuned ears, eyes, noses, tongues. They can pick up things that you and I don't necessarily pick up. Tanaka actually confirmed this to me. So Tanaka, when he retired, he was the general manager of Johnson & Johnson Japan. And so he's got all. I get all kinds of great, business anecdotes from him. I have a great time picking his brain when we're together. And I asked him about this, and he said, "Yeah, it's a real thing." He said, "Actually, at Johnson & Johnson Japan, Johnson & Johnson is, I think, 191 different companies that comprise Johnson & Johnson."
Right.
And my dad used to work for Johnson & Johnson. That's the tie-in to how I know Tanaka. He said that in the Japanese market, the Asian market in general, they would manufacture products a little bit differently than the ones that they export to the West for the products that are being manufactured in Japan. And I asked him if he ever brought any of this up to his counterparts in the West. He said, "Yeah, we used to try, and they just weren't getting what we were saying, so we just stopped." And so they get one quality, Japanese market gets another, because in Japan they notice. In Asia they notice.
Yeah.
And the
Yep.
example that he used was visually, the spectrum of visible light that they get is actually broader and more fine-tuned than our eyes. And so especially in the blue spectrum, like all those indigo shades,
Yep.
and we actually stopped at a shop, and there was a whole bunch of colored fabric, and he asked me how many different shades of blue I saw. And I said I could tell about 10 different shades of blue. And he and the lady that was there laughed because they both saw like 50. So they could differentiate. They'd pull out pieces of fabric and they'd put it next to each other and they say, "Could you tell a difference?" I'd be like, "No, it's the same fabric." And they're like, "No, these are two different colors." Like, what? Like,
Whoa.
two different shades. Yeah, so they even illustrated it for me up front. And so it kind of confirmed what I already knew. My wife tells me the same thing too. We have way more fun than we should, comparing and contrasting when we taste things, when we see things, when we smell things, because she and I have, it's like we have different experiences sometimes. And part of that can be subjective because scent has to do with memory, but part of it I think is also biological because our noses and our tongues and our eyes there are physical differences between them. So to go back to the Kiara question, I pulled out, these are 3 pieces that I hang on to usually as kind of as reference materials. This is all stuff that I picked up in Japan. And these are 3 pieces of really nice Shem Kiara. So this is probably Vietnamese, and even more specifically, this is probably from the Nha Trang region of Vietnam. And this would be a piece, it's a little hard to tell, but this is what's called Tiger Kinam because of the pattern. And then that's a nice, thick, solid kind of bead grade piece. And I've hung on to these for years. And when you smell these, they do have a room temp aroma. These are older pieces. They're not too oily to touch, but when you cut into it, you can tell it's nice and oily. And then when you look at these under a microscope, they definitely have they have that particular type of resin pattern that I was talking about that you see in genuine Kinam. And so, as you're smelling these, it's not just about the scent. Kind of like you were saying, it's also about that medical action. There's that bitterness to it, and then it does have a cooling action, and there's kind of an anchor, settle, and calm effect as it helps you to kind of settle your spirit and to focus and center. And then also to clear heat from the heart, so it does have that. So in Chinese medicine, we say that heat harasses the heart. And so even things like a lot of anxiety. So the heart and small intestine are paired organs. There's actually 4 organs that are part of the fire element, but the heart and small intestine are paired organs. And a large part, I'd say 80 to 90% of the anxiety that I see in clinic is actually digestive with people. There's a lot of food sensitivities and artificial junk that people eat.
Mm-hmm.
And most of it is actually centered in their small intestine. And then that kind of harasses the heart. And that's what makes them kind of get anxious.
Yeah.
And even with my clients, with different types of oil distillation, so what we call
Okay.
new gen types of
Yeah.
distillation, where there's no soaking, they're very clean types of distillation, no fermentation. People who have anxiety, those tens of oils tend to exacerbate their problem, makes their anxiety worse. And part of that is
Okay.
because they're real kind of top notey, brain piercing kind of
Yeah.
scents. And so I tell
Yeah.
them that they would those kinds of people would do better with more Hindi style distillations where there's a fermentation and a little bit of like a barnyard note because those oils actually have more of an anchor, settle, and calm action, whereas new
Okay.
gens are more pick me up. And so if people are kind of sluggish,
Yeah.
lethargic, depressed, they do better with new gens. And if people are real like anxiety and way too active, brain won't quiet down, they do better with barnyard type oils because they kind of pull everything down. And
Yeah,
the
that
same
makes
can be
sense.
said with Kinam. If you're real like up in your head, active, agitated, anxiety, Kinam is a really good thing to smell and to heat a little piece of because it should bring you back down to earth a little bit.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. At least for me, like I'm not really able to wear agarwood before I sleep. I just notice it kind of keeps me a little bit too active. But sandalwood's no problem. So that kind of makes sense with what you're saying. Just kind of on an even
Sandalwood actually, they say
wider
helps more
scale.
with sleep.
Yeah,
Yeah, sandalwood we would say actually helps more with sleep. That
definitely.
reminds me, somebody was asking me after the last talk to talk a little bit about medical action. And so I
Sure.
mentioned that Kiara has a bitterness and helps to clear heat from the heart, whereas agarwood is more warming to the stomach and kidneys. Now, the thing in terms of meditation and also in terms of how scents are paired from an Asian perspective, because we think of like meditation stuff, Buddhism, Taoism, like all the culture is tied in with the medicine, and they both kind of inform one another. And
Right.
so, if agarwood warms the stomach and kidneys, sandalwood warms the stomach and lungs.
Okay.
Okay, now agarwood, we say in Chinese medicine that when you take a deep breath, it's actually the kidneys that take the breath and
Yeah.
the lungs that expel. And you can even see this when you take a big breath, your rib cage loosens up. But when you push it out, that's when the muscles squeeze your lungs. And so the inhale is what we would say is the kidneys grasping the chi to pull down the breath. And then it's
Mm-hmm.
the lungs that push it out. So the kidneys move down and then the lungs move it back up. This is important because sandalwood and agarwood is paired a lot of times in incense because it helps to connect and to move the breath up and down so that you actually take deeper breaths. And
Wow.
so
Okay.
when you see incense formulations, when you see scents and things like this is why sandalwood and agarwood are usually paired together in meditative blends because it has that action of up and down with the breath. Whereas if you have agarwood, it just helps you to deepen the breath. If you just have sandalwood, it helps more in the exhale. And so with sleep, because it helps to warm the lungs, and it helps the lungs also, we say the flavor of the lungs is pungent, and so there's a dispersing action, right?
Yeah.
And so it helps to disperse chi accumulations, which is why sometimes with getting your lungs pumping and breathing techniques, it helps to remove those stagnations, those frustrations, and calm you down. And so I think that's part of the action of smelling
Yep.
sandalwood before bed is that actually it helps to the free flow of chi. We're using like Chinese medicine language here, but it helps things to move freely in the body, which will help to cool you down, relax you, and kind of ease all the systems, slip you from sympathetic into parasympathetic, and then you kind of like come down a little bit. You like my
Yeah, that
spirit?
makes sense too with yeah. It makes sense what you were saying earlier too about the sandalwood and the agarwood being paired together. And then it's for a lot of the Japanese incense blends, it's usually those two and then a bunch of the kind of like spicy, maybe cinnamon or clove or all these other different very kind of pungent spicy things, which I think based on everything you're saying has that kind of dispersing, kind of clearing quality. So it's kind of like in terms of the medicinal compounds, it's sort of connecting those two things, calming things down, but also kind of clearing things out in kind of a basic sense. Because it's one thing I realized getting, going through so many incenses from so many different incense houses, for example. I noticed a lot of similar ingredients being used, obviously, but then I noticed each house would kind of, for a lot of their stuff, have basically kind of like the same formula, but it's like what I realize is it's like, oh, they're selling 10 different versions of the same formula, but each one is like a step up in the quality of the materials and maybe a slight tweaking in the balance of the materials. And I can think of a handful of incense houses that I tried where it's like, yeah, it's the same, basically the same formula all the way up and down. So that kind of makes a lot of sense with what everything you've said so far about the actions of sandalwood, agarwood, and then a lot of the other supportive things, whether it's cinnamon or clove or a bunch of the other ones that are usually in there.
Yeah, they might change the quality of the material. They might change the origin of the material. They might change the powder, so the preparation method of that material.
Yeah, yeah,
They may also uh, change the ratio of materials, and then they
yep,
may include or remove one or more materials from the formula so that the core of it remains the same, but then there's a slight change in the function of something. And
yep.
so, yeah, I mean, usually you'll see like borneol, clove, turmeric, patchouli. So if you're
Hmm.
talking about actions, patchouli helps to clear damp. So it's
Okay.
an earth medicinal, spleen medicinal that helps to clear damp, and so it's really good, especially in humid environments, and also where there's dampness in the body. Without going into too much Chinese medicine, what that means, but that's what that means. Turmeric, we hear about it being anti-inflammatory, but what we would say is that it moves blood and clears heat. So
Yep.
this is why it helps with pain. When there's in Chinese medicine, we would say where there's no movement, there's pain. Where there's pain, there's no
Yep.
movement. And so turmeric
Right.
helps to move blood and then clear some of that heat. Borneol uh, helps to pierce. So it helps to clear the pathway to the Shen. So for the
Ah,
five
that's right.
senses, right? And so borneol helps to pierce through all the fog, the dampness, to deliver a clear message to the heart, the Shen. Clove helps to warm the spleen again for where there's dampness, and then that spiciness, the acridity of it too, has a little bit of a dispersing action for dampness, and then also it helps to kind of elevate the other materials. I tell people a lot to think in terms of cooking. When you cook, it's
Yep.
like you add a pinch of salt or a splash of vinegar or a splash of fish sauce, and it helps
Yeah.
to elevate the whole dish. A lot of these materials kind of act like that as well. And so when you look through the materials that are used in making various Japanese incense, like you said, they're kind of like different levels of, or like different
Right.
variations of the same thing. And all of them are usually being used in terms of meditation. So it's about clearing the senses, improving the
Yep.
breath, anchor, settle, calm the spirit, so that your heart, like there's no irritation, agitation from the organs. You can clear your mind and you can focus. Reach that kind of that Zen zone of
Sure.
clear thinking where you get rid of outside thought so that You can have inspiration. Like this is why we say you listen to incense. You have to quiet the mind
Right.
and listen to what it says.
Yeah, that definitely, I mean, without going into it too much, in terms of Tai Chi and many of the other internal arts, there's a Chinese word that they use, which is ting, like Ting. I don't know the tone or whatever, but that loosely or roughly translates to listen. So at least with like any basic sitting practice, whether it's a breathing thing or even in Tai Chi or other stuff, if it's standing or moving practice, it's basically part of the initial thing is getting your awareness to absorb into whatever the object is, stabilize into that object, but actually listen to that object, which is actually a very different quality of awareness. And then even within listening, there's classically different levels of listening. Like first it's with the ears, and then it's with the heart, and then it's with the shin and the shin. It's like a whole progression of different layers of listening and absorption and whatever. But that's a whole other thing. But why listening is like the better term is because it's slightly more of a passive form of intent that doesn't necessarily trigger the visual cortex in that apparatus of the brain, which is usually more active. Because usually, at least as it relates to Tai Chi or meditation, if you're saying, I'm going to have this intention, I'm going to do this thing because I want this outcome and because I'm doing all this stuff, it's basically already kind of a lot of constriction and constraint and force that you're trying to push into something, which then if it's already that, then there's not really space for whatever the thing is that you're trying to interact with or absorb into. So listening kind of removes a lot of that stuff and is a bit more passive and is actually a different quality of awareness, which if we talk about some of the bridge and the crossover between many of these facets and the transformational benefit actually comes from developing the listening quality. Because if you actually really can start to listen to aromatics, as an example, the more you can listen, the more you're going to hear, the more you're going to pick up, the more depth you're going to get, the more you're going to get out of it. But then also that quality of awareness will change the way your nervous system, your breath will start to relax. You'll naturally be more present. Like all these other things will start to happen. And then if actually you can really stabilize that as a quality of your awareness, when you're interacting with people, you're interacting with the world, you're eating food, you're doing all these things, you actually can operate from more of that listening quality, which is not so based on intention or contraction and all of that other kind of constraint. And that actually can free up a lot of chi flow, if you want to put it that way, but also genuinely can enhance your overall quality of life. So that's just kind of a tangent to how some of these things would interrelate, because they can start to develop that listening quality, which is it is a different quality of awareness, and it is a different, it's the word listening for a specific reason. It's not, yeah. So hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. And I think that's really where a lot of the transformation can happen for people.
Absolutely. I think, like you were saying, listening is there's an active component to listening, and it's that focus. And like you said,
Yep.
it doesn't engage the full brain, but it engages it in a way that gives attention, and there's intention in what you're doing. Which reminds me, also, we started to talk about it, and then we got sidetracked, like I usually do.
Right.
So I have made a few actual wild, genuine Kiara extractions. And the last one I did, this was back in 2021. This was my by Kinam. And the projects have been kind of labors of love where I've had to get shavings and broken bits and pieces and kind of the the less expensive top grade stuff as opposed to getting like full pieces like this, which will
Right.
command a higher price. And the first oil that I did was blue Kiara. And I actually made two oils. I made a creative, which was the blue Kiara, and then I made a pure oil, which didn't even hit my website. I had three clients come in and buy it all. And then the blue Kiara was 99.5% a mix of, it wasn't a mix, it was a co-distillation, a co-extraction of both Vietnamese and Hainan Chinese wild Kinam. This one is a pure wild Kinam oil, and it's wild, not plantation. And you'll understand the difference when you see the price tag on it because it's
For sure.
right. These were real labors of love. They are
Hmm.
expensive. They sell kind of slowly, but
Yeah.
Blue Kiara was interesting because, like I said, there's a pure oil and then the 0.5%. I added uh, an actual distilled blue lotus, Indian blue lotus. So almost all the blue lotus that you see on the market today is a solvent extraction, and there's not a whole lot of it that we see. And even when we do, they tend to be kind of poor quality. I don't want to say low quality, but they're not the best extractions that
Right.
you can do. And so this was an actual distilled batch of Blue Lotus, which was I was the way that I marketed it was it's kind of like the Kiara of Blue Lotus. And so it wasn't there to smell like Blue Lotus, it was there to accentuate the Kinam. And
Right.
I think it paired perfectly. Everybody that had it has absolutely loved it. And it's become kind of a legend. People who are in the know talk about this stuff. And every once in a while, I'll be contacted out of the blue, and people are like, "I have smelled your blue Kiara, and it's great. Like I've never smelled anything like it." Well, the same I would say is true of this wild white Hainan. And so, white Kinam, there's all these different kind of classifications of Kinam based on the
Right.
kind of scent profile, but also some physical characteristics. If you look at the resin up close, and white Kinam tends to be the
Hmm.
most floral. And when you're reading Asian sources, they'll usually talk about a chrysanthemum note. Is a lot of times
Okay.
what they'll call it. This, I
Yeah.
would say, has the chrysanthemum note, although I would say, to my nose, it smells a little bit more like osmanthus. It's got kind of like a real floral tonality to it. Chrysanthemum
Yeah.
also has a bitterness to it, which is why I think it gets
Yeah.
called a bitter, a chrysanthemum note. And this, if you guys have watched the video on YouTube of Alex from the Perfume Chronicles smelling blue Kiara, he would hold it to his nose, and he's actually coming here for Thanksgiving this year.
Oh, nice.
Let the cat out of the bag, so maybe I'll get him to smell this one as well and see if we don't get a similar response out of him.
I'm sure he
Alex
will, man.
from the Perfume Chronicles. If you haven't read his stuff, he's got a great blog to read, and he's a great artist in and of himself. And so this has that kind of floral tonality that we'll call chrysanthemum, and then
Uh
the
huh.
heart of it smells really, really like honeyed wood. I mean, people will try this,
Yeah.
and it's like just oud honey, and it's thick and resinous. I mean, you can even see if we can see here how thick of an oil this is.
Yeah. It's almost like
Very,
raw honey or something.
oh yeah, it's very slow moving, and I mean this will buy you a house. Um,
Yeah.
it it's it's something that if you have a chance, you really should splurge and try it. And as we've been talking about previously, like I do offer like 0.1 gram sample sizes on some
Yeah.
things, this being one of them, because the price is just so astronomical. I'm trying to make it as feasibly accessible as possible.
Sure.
Um, and for the people that do try it, I get really interesting feedback on it. Every once in a while, somebody will be like, "Oh, I wish it was more bitter," and I'm like I have control over how it. I only have so much control over how it comes out. Um,
Right. Right.
but every once in a while, when people do buy samples of it, they're like, "I would not have even known that this was oud if you didn't tell me." Like it's so ethereal and floral coming out of the bottle. When you put it on, obviously there's that kind of like floral tone to it, but then that just thick honey oud resin, you smell it, and I mean, like eye opening. I mean, it's really transformative. I should get you some so that you can know what I'm talking about. I see you salivating over there. feel like I'm
Yeah,
showing
it
the
is.
dog food. It's like it's just rude of me.
I mean, I'm following the journey. I'm like, yes, yes.
Tell me more. Tell me more.
I know, man. That sounds absolutely unbelievable.
This
But I
is
can't.
I would say this is a pinnacle collection. This
Yeah,
is this is true king shit. I mean, all of these things are king shit, but this is real king shit. This is not something that you buy to wear and impress others. This is something that you buy to impress yourself. This is
yeah,
you wear this for you.
yeah.
And most people who buy some, they don't even wear it. I mean, it's so, I don't know what you want to call it, biologically active. I mean, it's so active,
Just
even
just
just
huff it
smelling
from
it.
the bottle.
Yeah, I mean, even just smelling it will kind of calm you down.
Yeah.
Maybe calm you down. Me, I don't seem to calm down. I just get too excited talking about all this.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's one of those things that you get to use when you are away from everyone and you have no distractions and no other chatter. It's like you want to lock yourself in a closet and just sit with it. Kind of one of those things. But I
So
mean,
it's funny. After smelling
yeah,
this wood, this batch of wood that I have, I
yeah,
hate using the term, but I would say it is Kenamic. It is Kenam like. This is from Can Hoa, which is the region in Vietnam where Nha Trang is.
right.
So Nha Trang is in Can Hoa, and this batch of wood all came from the same tree, and it's very,
Is that
to
the
my
one that
nose.
you had on your store?
Yeah. So this is the Can Hoa Ant King.
Yeah,
So, I'm usually not selling whole pieces. Every once in a while, people request whole pieces. It is not inexpensive wood. This is expensive wood, and I cut it down. And
yeah,
then I usually offer this pre-cut because people who buy the stuff usually don't have the tools or the know-how to cut it down. But
yeah,
I would say this is Kenamic wood. If you're wanting to buy something that is not the price of Kenam, this is
yeah.
a really great place to start. And
No, I have both of I have some of that wood and I had some of the black Kiara,
mhm.
and that stuff is pretty darn similar. I mean, it's maybe
Yeah,
80,
there's
ninety
similarities.
percent And I feel like you'd have to really, yeah, you'd have to really, really know to discern big differences between the two. So I think in terms of getting a Kenom experience for a fraction of the price, it's definitely the way to go. And that stuff has so much freaking resin and oil in it or whatever. It's just dense. It just oozes. So yeah, I have some of that stuff left, and I don't even heat it that much. I just open the jar and take a whiff, and then that's it.
You don't even need to. When I was in Japan, last time I was in Japan, some of the stores, some of the companies, I should say, and again, you go into these places and you ask for things. People either they don't necessarily have everything.
Right.
That's the first thing, and then the second thing is my contacts bother me a little bit. Sorry, I keep rubbing on my eye.
It's all right.
Um, the other thing is you have to know how to ask for it.
Exactly.
And one of the places that I went had Kinam, and then they had several specimens of near Kinam.
Mm.
For lack of a better expression, they were Kinamic.
Right. Right.
And my guess is that they could have also been non-Shem Kinam. So they could have been Kinam from different regions so that they were Kinamic smelling. And the funny thing
Mm-hmm.
is, they had like 7 or 8 different samples already pre-cut, 1 gram in a vial. And I sat there and I went through with Tanaka and we smelled each one. And I'm like, okay, I like this one. He likes this one. Which ones do we like? And I think I bought a little bit of 4 different samples or 4 different
Okay.
pieces that he and one of us liked.
Right. Right.
And there was like 1 or 2 of them that both of us really loved it, and then there was one that he really loved, one that I really loved. The one that I loved, he'd smell it and be like, ah. but I liked it, so who cares? And
Right, right.
I took those home as study pieces because again, when you get these woods, and even then I get batches, and I'll get big batches like this, and I
Uh-huh.
might have 2 kilos that come out of one tree. Okay, or you get two
Hmm.
kilos and it's a mixed batch, and you can go through all of these batches, and sometimes there might be one or two pieces that are extra special. You pull those
Yeah,
out, right, and you
right.
set those aside, and those get sold separately. And kind of like that stuff we were talking about earlier with one of the first batches of Vietnamese wood that I bought, and a very large portion of it was more or less like Kinam, and the piece that I gave to Tanaka was definitely Kinam. I mean, I pulled that piece out and gave it to him because
Yep.
the one that I liked the best in the batch, and it was like the size of my finger, like three of my fingers. So imagine, like 3 fingers. That's not even 3 fingers. That just gives you a reference size
Yeah.
for how big it was.
Oof.
And yeah, it's there can be really special pieces in batches that aren't necessarily Kiara or
Right.
Kenam. So that's also something that you'll see in the
Yeah.
market is that really unique individual pieces will be pulled out and sold, and those will be, again, because a large part of its value,
Yep.
there'll be a higher price because there's a higher value on the uniqueness of the material. There's
Yeah, I think that
sorry.
I was going to say that I think that just adds another layer of kind of complexity and interest and intrigue to the whole thing.
There's an Indian batch that I had in the shop
Uh-huh.
that is sold out now, but I had a customer who's out in Hawaii. Maybe you're listening too. She'll know who I'm talking about. And and she was like, "Yeah, I really don't like those kenomic woods. That batch was way too kenomic for me." But remember, I told you those sometimes those notes can kind of agitate people's anxiety even more. And so for
Yeah,
her, she
true,
needs
true.
something that's more anchor, settle, and calm. She seems to do better with, well, it was a Hindi batch. It was an Indian batch, strangely enough.
Uh-huh.
And so she uh, was looking for more like leathery tones and less kenomic
Yeah.
wood. But I heard from a lot of people that that batch was really kind of, it was like Indian Kenam, and for the price, if you're getting Kenam at the price I was selling it, that was a steal. So it's
Yeah.
funny sometimes too, as I get feedback from customers, even they'll tell me like, "Oh man, I got 5 pieces of wood from you, and one of them in particular was just like, why can't
Yeah.
every piece be like that?" I'm like, "Yeah, tell me about it." So it was all excellent wood, but that one piece was just, or
Right.
sometimes I'll have people that buy a piece like this, a big piece,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll be like, "From here over is crazy. This is good. But man, anytime I smell something I cut from this side, it's crazy." And so that's also important to remember is that even there can be variation even within a single piece.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we're dealing with a natural material that, we don't fully understand exactly everything about how it forms and how it comes about. And it is basically the tree's immune response. So it is this kind of, I don't know the best word for it, but just kind of this kind of unpredictable, spontaneous thing that's like not so easily exactly pinned down. So, but I feel like we've definitely covered a lot of stuff, and I feel like we could pretty much sit here for the next 6 hours and keep geeking out about all these different facets. But I feel like, at least for what we set out to accomplish, which is try to shed some light and set more context on what Kiara and Kinam is and isn't, and also, demonstrate kind of a little bit of the ephemeral, elusive, mysterious nature of it, but at least enough to give people, a jumping off point and an entry point into it if they are new to it, and then hopefully maybe some deeper understanding if they have been, already using it before. So definitely appreciate you making the time and coming on again and sharing your encyclopedic knowledge on the subject. It's definitely a lot of fun. I definitely learned a lot. And I'm sure basically everyone watching and listening is extremely envious of all the pieces you kept flashing out. And especially yeah, I mean, just,
We'll go out on a high note.
yeah, might as well, man. I mean, I don't know if you can go higher than the white Kenam oil. I mean, that seems like pretty top of the mountain, but hey, let's not limit
Everybody buys
ourselves.
some, so I can put the funds to. Everybody buys some, so I can put the funds together to make another
Uh-huh.
batch.
Okay. Let's do it. We'll start a crowdfunding or a GoFundMe or whatever, and we'll try to get as many people as possible to support, you know, White Kenam Batch 2.0 or something. Basically, things that never really occurred historically, I highly doubt. I think it'd probably be one of the first or second times that it's ever happened. So definitely own a piece of history, put it that way. Well, cool,
I like
man.
where
Yeah,
your head.
thanks so much again. What's that?
I said I like where your head is at.
But yeah, definitely, I highly recommend everyone check out your shop on Etsy, Rising Phoenix Perfume, and of course there'll be links below for everything. And if you have questions about anything, JK is super readily available and accessible, and very, very helpful. I mean, I've already talked to a few people that had already reached out and ordered from you from our first episode. So that's how we connected. I mean, I had a bunch of questions about agarwood and oils and stuff, probably, I don't know, 2018 or something when I got into this stuff. And JK helped me out quite a lot and answered a lot of my questions. And so, yeah, definitely appreciate it. And hopefully, people have made it this far into the podcast and have enjoyed everything we've been sharing so far. So, thanks again, man.
Really appreciate you having me here. Thank you,